All right, well, hello everyone. This is Lydia Olander from the Nicholas Institute at Duke University. And with help from Sarah Mason, we're hosting another National Ecosystem Services Partnership webinar today. And today we have, I'm very happy to say, we have Bonnie Keeler as our guest speaker. She'll be talking about different methods, different values, how the choice of ecosystem services valuation methods can affect cost-benefit analysis and prioritization decisions. But before we turn it over to her, I just have a few quick announcements. So first, I just wanted to note a new journal article out using some of the NESP approaches with the ecosystem services conceptual models for forest planning case in the United States. And so that paper is available as well as some resources on the web. And I think Sarah will put some links in the chat related to that. And I also wanted to mention a special issue of ecosystem services on natural capital accounting. And papers have been slowly filtering into that special issue, and a number of them are on developing pilot accounts for the United States. There's an ecosystem accounts paper, land accounts, water accounts, and urban ecosystem accounts that are all already available online on that issue that might be of interest. And then I wanted to mention a couple other upcoming webinars. So our June NESP webinar is on payments for forest-based ecosystem services from private lands in the United States that Greg Fry from US Forest Service will be presenting. And then we also wanted to mention a project webinar on the GEMS project, which is about standardized metrics for monitoring social and economic outcomes of Gulf restoration that our team at Duke and some partners from the Hart Research Institute will be presenting. Okay, now quickly, I just want to introduce Bonnie. So Bonnie is an assistant professor at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs at University of Minnesota. She works at the intersection of sustainability science and environmental economics with particular expertise in water management and policy. As a member of the External Environmental Economics Advisory Committee, an independent organization providing nonpartisan advice on the state of economic sciences as it relates to the EPA's programs, Keeler is currently reviewing recent changes to the Clean Water Act. And I want to add my own personal note. Bonnie is an engaged scholar with an incredible breadth and depth of experience and research that I have had the pleasure of working with over the last few years. She gave a version of this talk that she's going to be giving today at a workshop I was part of that was on valuing broad suite of benefits provided by the Great Lakes. And I thought it was a fantastic set of work that could really inform how ecosystem services valuation is thought about, helping us think about which approaches to valuation are best to meet different needs and how using a suite of valuation methods might give us a richer understanding of the values of nature. So I very much wanted her to share this work with our community. So thank you very much, Bonnie. And I want to turn it over to you and you can start sharing your slides whenever you're ready.
I'll unmute myself and share my screen. And can you just confirm, Lydia, that you are able to?
Yeah, it's perfect.
Okay, fantastic. And does this work when I advance it? Okay, awesome. All right, well, thank you for that introduction. And it's nice to get a chance to share some of this work with all of you. I only have maybe half an hour worth of material, so I really hope that we can have some dialogue as I go through or at the end of my talk, lots of things that could stimulate some discussion. So as Lydia mentioned, I've been working in the ecosystem services area for a couple of decades now, mostly at the interface of ecological models and economic models. And my particular expertise is in understanding the value of water quality. And I've been really interested in understanding the ways in which we map and model and monitor ecosystem service values and how that translates into the way that we use that information in decisions. So I'm going to spend just a few minutes sort of setting up the motivation for the talk. Why do we need this kind of information, this value information, especially for things that we consider so invaluable like water quality, and then review some of the different methods and the different values that come out of those different methods. And in this case, I'm going to review some of the more traditional non-market valuation methods that you're probably familiar with, as well as some alternative methodologies that haven't really caught on in mainstream economics. Some of the findings that are resulting from that work, and then propose a framework and some recommendations for a more inclusive, set of valuation methods to consider as we move forward with ecosystem services research. So I think this concept is obviously going to be familiar for folks on this call, but I want to center us in why we do this work so that we can return to that decision context as we review the different methods that we're looking at in this talk. So if you think about this particular scene here, this is a forest actually in southern Minnesota. We know that if you just count the value of the timber in this forest, you're going to get a very incomplete assessment of the true value of that forest ecosystem, because that forest is also providing flood mitigation, it's providing habitat for game and non-game wildlife species, it's providing drinking water for that town, it's increasing property values, it's providing shade for a recreational trout stream, habitat for beneficial insects, and more. And we know that when we start to incorporate these values, these ecosystem services into decisions, and when we can go as far as actually putting monetary values on some of those services, it starts to tip the balance of policies in different directions. This is an example from several years ago in Minnesota where some ecosystem service valuation work that we did at the University of Minnesota was taken up then by our Public Utilities Commission and used to update the values of social cost of carbon approaches. And that actually changed the set of energy permits that were acted on by the state. So by starting to put some values around those non-market benefits that are provided, in this case, the cost of pollution from fossil fuel-based energy production, when you put values on that, it can change the equation, it can change the types of decisions and the permitting decisions that were made in this case about energy production. So we know that understanding and quantifying these values can have important impacts in decisions. When it comes to water quality, this has been trickier. We've had a harder time making the case that the benefits of water quality based on ecosystem valuation of water quality changes are actually a good return on investment. And on the right, you'll see an excerpt from a paper by Dave Kaiser and others in PNAS a couple of years ago that really addressed this issue head on, looking at how much money we spend on water quality, and then the estimates of the benefits, so the return on investment from those water quality investments. And what they found was that the median benefit to cost ratio of investments in water quality was far less than 1. So if you have a 1-to-1 benefit to cost ratio, you're demonstrating that the benefits of your policy at least meet the cost of executing that particular policy. In this case, summarizing the economics on water valuation over the past several decades, these authors were unable to find a really compelling case that the benefits of water quality improvements outweighed the cost of implementing those, okay? So that's a really important and provocative policy implication. Some of that research and those studies were also used by the Trump administration is in part of their economic analysis that advocated for rollbacks for the Clean Water Act, and specifically in removing some controls on particular types of streams and wetlands. So the point here is that having these numbers can make a difference. Not having these numbers can also have an impact on policy. And so there's an urgent need, I think, to try and figure out how do we do a good job of quantifying the benefits of ecosystem services such that we're informing policies at the state, at the federal, at the local level, making the best possible decisions. But I want to scale that up just a little bit bigger, and that beyond just thinking about benefits and costs. And now what in this talk, I want to take us a little bit beyond just the standard benefit cost framework that economists typically use, in which we're looking at individual decisions about how we weigh trade-offs as part of a consumer model. And that's a way of measuring economic efficiency. So how do the investments that we make in improving environmental quality affect changes in well-being at the level of individuals that we can then aggregate up to the full population to make some claims about net social welfare changes that result from environmental policies. The Biden administration has signaled that they're not abandoning that framework, but that they're very interested in an expanded set of policy objectives beyond just efficiency. They want to fully account for the benefits that are both difficult or impossible to quantify using those standard non-monetary approaches. And they also are very keen to address distributional consequences of regulations. So including both quantitative and qualitative analysis of costs and benefits, with a goal on making sure that we're not disproportionately burdening disadvantaged, vulnerable, or marginalized communities. So what we have here is a framework that still cares about efficiency, and I'm going to continue to talk about how these different methods can tell us something about the policy objective of efficiency, which is very important for assessing the net benefits of proposed rules or regulations, which we're required to do at the federal level. But also these other policy objectives that the Biden administration and others have signaled are really important and need to be a bigger part of regulatory review going forward. And yet I don't think we've actually figured out exactly how to merge these different policy objectives. So this is something where I think it'd be great to hear from all of you about how you see these kinds of objectives playing out in your own work and in your own organizations. So that means objectives like equity, is it advancing goals of justice and fairness? Distributional concerns, other things like desirability. Do people actually want this policy? Is it viable? Is it achievable? Can we implement it? Is it feasible? So there's a whole suite of other objectives to policy analysis that are also important to consider beyond just economic efficiency. Okay, so with that setup of really thinking comprehensively about how we evaluate the pros and cons of different environmental policies across a suite of multiple policy objectives, I was interested in figuring out, as we look across all the different methods that we have at our disposal and trying to understand the value of ecosystem services, the value of environmental changes, as we use those different methods, we're getting a lot of information about values on the other end of those methods. And if we look at all the information that's coming out on values, then does that suggest different kinds of decisions or very different policy directions, depending on the kinds of methods you use, the insights you gain from those, how you interpret and apply them, right? So very interested in the policy implications of how we decide which valuation methods to use. What are the insights from those methods? And then what do we do with that information on the other end? So this is just a snapshot of some of the many studies that I'm going to review. I won't go through all of them, but just to say that we focused on the state of Minnesota as our case study because we had several decades of many different kinds of water valuation studies done in this particular area. So it was a useful case to analyze if we wanted to look retrospectively across a set of many different methods that led to many different values, and really say, how is this information collectively, synthetically giving us insights into different decisions about how we manage water resources and ecosystem services? So water, I think for many of you know, it's complicated. It's not just one service. It's actually many, many services that affect many different endpoints: lakes, rivers, streams, groundwater, wetlands, lots of different kinds of uses, recreation, human health, cultural values. So it can't just be one method to look across all these water-related services. We're actually looking at a portfolio of many different methodologies to try and understand the value of changes in water quality. This is a table from a paper I published several years ago in PNAS that laid out a framework for linking biophysical and hydrologic models with economic models to try and really track changes in water-related ecosystem services, from where different constituents, different pollutants enter waterways, where they go if they end up in lakes or groundwater. What's the actual attribute that people care about? Is it water clarity? Is it the amount of nitrate? Is it phosphorus? Is it sediment? Is it temperature? And then who uses that water at those different places? Are we talking about lakeshore property owners? Are we talking about recreationists, well owners? These are very different groups that have very different values for those changes in water quality. And then what are the approaches to valuation that you can use to translate those into changes in welfare or well-being? So in this broad review, we focused on both what I would call sort of traditional mainstream approaches at estimating the value of changes in water quality. And that includes things like avoided cost studies. So as water becomes contaminated, then households will have to incur costs in order to treat that water to meet standards. Hedonic models, where you look at the impact of changes in water quality on property values. Travel cost models that estimate how much further people are willing to travel to visit clear lakes versus less clear lakes or less polluted rivers, and then contingent valuation or stated preference studies where people are getting surveys and asking questions like, how much would you be willing to pay for improved water quality in the Minnesota River? Here's just a couple of snapshots from those. I'm not going to spend so much time reviewing the methods or the insights from these studies because I think there's been many reviews of how you can use various water quality, sort of standard non-market water quality methods to estimate the value of changes in water quality. But just to note that there's been several of these kinds of studies in Minnesota. Some have looked at lakes, some have looked at rivers, some have been statewide, some have been regional, and I'll give some insight into what we've learned from these studies at the end. What I do want to give you is just a quick tour of what I would call the sort of alternative metrics that aren't conforming to that standard econometric or consumer choice model of valuation that is used primarily by environmental economists to look at the value of changes in ecosystem services. So one of the methods that I'm sure many people, many agencies and lots of staff across Minnesota use is looking at ecosystem service metrics and indicators. So in this case, we're allowing the units to stay in whatever biophysical or it could be in social or economic terms. We're not worried about conversion to dollar values. Really just looking at the spatial heterogeneity across multiple objectives and using biophysical data, social economic data to try and map the spatial distribution of where you're going to get the best return on investment if you invest in a particular desired water quality attribute. So these are just some of many maps that we've made in the state of Minnesota. But this is for the decision context of, let's say you're the Clean Water Council and you have a fixed budget and you're trying to decide where in the state to spend those resources, where you're going to get the best return of ecosystem services. If you're investing with the objective of improving trout visitation and trout water habitat, you might invest in the dark blue watersheds on the left. If you're focused on drinking water and groundwater contamination and reducing the number of people that are vulnerable to nitrate exposure, then you might look at that red map and focus on the dark red watersheds. If you're interested in improving lakes where lots of people swim and recreate that are also highly sensitive to phosphorus pollution, then that's the third map. And then last, if your objective is to reduce the load of nutrients downstream to actually people outside of the state boundaries, either in the Gulf of Mexico, in Lake Winnipeg, or in the Great Lakes Basin, then that points to, again, another set of watersheds. So lots of ways to use these kinds of spatial ecosystem service metrics. One of the big take homes from this work for us and for the decision makers we've been working with is that there aren't a lot of win-wins here. What you're actually seeing are pretty important trade-offs spatially in terms of whose values are you prioritizing, which of these ecosystem service metrics are the most important, and that you can't necessarily get all of these water quality benefits by investing in the same places. We have also translated those maps into a set of decision support tools, and the URL down at the bottom, pbat.umn.edu, is one of them. You're welcome to look it up and get all the methodologies that underlie this graph. But here's just one example of how this has been applied. So here's a tool that we pulled together for a funding organization in the state of Minnesota that was interested in a suite of different objectives. So now we're translating those maps into this comparison tool. So we have spatial maps for each of those objectives on the y-axis. The orange bar in this case refers to a potential parcel or acquisition. So this is a set of a particular parcel that the agency could purchase and restore or protect, and how that purchase, that one proposed parcel, compares to all the possible investments that someone could make statewide. So this particular parcel, if you look at just where those orange bars are relative to the underlying green bars, which refer to the distribution across the potential parcels, you can see that this particular parcel did very well for risk of conversion and proximity to population. It did fairly well above average for pheasant production, soil carbon pollination. This was not a parcel that was going to score highly for wild rice, for trout angling, for lake recreation, or for protecting groundwater nitrate, right? So it gives you a sense of not necessarily what's the exact return on investment in monetary terms, but it's telling you something about the relative value of this parcel versus the set of possible investments that one could make, incorporating spatial dynamics of these different services. So that's one method. Another method that we've started to experiment recently is using Qsort and other kinds of deliberative or participatory valuation methods. So the Qsort method is takes a set of cards. And so each of these little statements that you see here, there's 18 of them, are written on a little card that we hand out in a packet to each of the respondents. So they get a stack of 18 cards with each of these 18 values on one of them. And then they get a placemat, which is set up in a normal distribution, like you can see on the left. And they have to organize those cards on that placemat. And you can see a picture in the corner of participants engaging in this activity. So they're doing it both individually, as well as filling out a short questionnaire. And then they're doing it as a group to deliberate on how would you rank these values from least valued to most valued. And they have to put one card in each square. So they're forced to make some trade-offs among these different values. So this is a method that forces people to evaluate trade-offs across a set of different water quality objectives. You'll notice that a lot of these prompts map onto various water quality related ecosystem services, things like recreation, protection of habitat for fish and wildlife, drinking water protection, etc. In addition to those deliberative participatory methods, we also sent out a survey, a rating survey statewide to 6,000 households across the state of Minnesota to ask them about these same water values. So in this case, an individual respondent would get the survey. There's a whole set of questions, but one of the questions that maps onto the previous slide is a question that asks people, how important is it to you to protect and restore Minnesota waters for the following values and uses? And there's a ranking from highest to lowest in terms of your prioritization across these different values. And so the same set of values we provide to them, and then we ask them to rank each of those values on a scale of importance. And you can see the results here on the slide. So the highest score across all of the regions was drinking water was the most valued water value. The second was future generations. The third was habitat for native fish and wildlife. And the fourth was beaches and lakes that are safe for swimming and playing. We also asked them a question to prioritize a set of like a hypothetical funding exercise. So we gave them a budget and said what percent of the budget should we prioritize for each of these different kinds of water objectives: safe drinking water, fish and wildlife, swimming and boating, and then reducing contributions to outstate water quality problems. And for the most part, we saw really strong alignment between people's stated values and then the way that they wanted funding allocated according to their values. So here's just a summary of what we saw across statewide sort of average responses for those four different water quality objectives and how people said they wanted their state tax dollars allocated across those objectives. So I think there's some interesting insights from this. One is that we didn't see a lot of spatial heterogeneity across the state. Pretty much universally, everyone was interested in safe drinking water as the most important thing and wanted the majority of the funding to be allocated towards the protection of drinking water. But then we also found this real strong evidence that people cared about things like reducing contributions of pollution out of the state boundaries. And they cared a lot about future generations, and they cared about fish and wildlife populations. So these are values that are more altruistic, more ecospheric, more biophilic, as opposed to egocentric or human-centered values. So I thought that was an interesting insight. And then last, there's methods that don't force this lens of trade-offs onto decision makers or onto respondents, but actually invite people through narratives, through semi-structured interviews, through other kinds of more qualitative or ethnographic methods to reflect on the value of ecosystem services for their lives and livelihoods. So this is an excerpt from some work that Earth Economics did with Fond du Lac tribes of Lake Superior, Chippewa in Minnesota, looking at the value of wild rice lakes and wild rice production as a cultural value for their tribal resources. And I think what you see from these kinds of narrative assessments is a really deep-seated cultural, stewardship value, relational value that they express for water quality, and very much tied to stories and sense of place. And that these kind of ethnographic methods and more qualitative methods really allow for those values to be elevated, to really come to life and be articulated in ways that the traditional monetary methods or those sort of trade-off based methods make it very difficult to impose that kind of trade-off structure on something that's as deeply seated and deeply important as something that's essential to your history and sense of place. All right, so that's a quick tour of some of the various kinds of methods that were used to try and understand the value of water quality. We had a couple of research questions that we're interested in, then sort of reflecting back on this set of methods and what we learned from reviewing all of them. And one was just, do these different methods reveal different insights into the values of clean water? What are the implications for the prioritization of water actions, as well as equity and efficiency objectives when you think about the insights from these different valuation research methods? So if you're pulling the results of these methods and then trying to translate them into policy, how are we doing across a set of those different objectives? Are we maximizing efficiency? Are we prioritizing equity? Where do we see those in conflict? And then for me, I was really interested in, how is this informing my own praxis? Like, what kind of water valuation research should we do in the future? What should the next 10 years look like for ecosystem service valuation research? Are we studying the right things? Are we using the right methods? And what's going to be the most important in terms of informing state and federal water governance going forward? So I'll quickly summarize the findings. We're working on writing this up for publication right now. Love any feedback, or happy to share a draft manuscript with folks if you'd like to take a look at it. But some of the top line findings so far, and I hinted at this earlier, is that we're seeing a lot of evidence for more altruistic and biospheric values coming out of the surveys, the Qsort, the deliberative participatory work interviews. Those are the most valued statements that emerge from those kinds of methods on the left-hand side. Drinking water, future generations, habitat, natural systems and processes to be maintained, not sending water pollution downstream to other states or nations. And then when you look at the least valued statements that come out of those methods, among the least valued statements are those that are the focus of a lot of the traditional monetary non-market methods, like travel cost models and hedonic pricing models. And those are things like property owners being able to maintain their property values, towns and cities avoiding costly water treatment expenses, the anglers being able to fish for their preferred species. So there's an interesting disconnect, I think, between the toolkit of traditional non-market valuation that environmental economists have developed and used, and then the kinds of values that are coming from these more qualitative, more open-ended sort of participatory deliberative methodologies. As I mentioned earlier, when you use different methods and they produce insight into different values, that then leads you to different investment priorities. So whether you're thinking implicitly or explicitly about the values that underlie your investment priority, you're making value-laden decisions just by deciding to invest here versus here, to invest in this part of the state or a different watershed. You're automatically prioritizing a different set of values in making those decisions. And that there are really important spatial trade-offs in where we decide to invest in ecosystem service management, restoration, or protection. Now, very importantly, different kinds of values and associated methodologies are privileging the values of different beneficiaries. And so if you're thinking about who really benefits from investments in protecting rural water supplies versus who are we benefiting by protecting critical habitat for wild rice versus protecting and restoring water quality to improve lakeshore property values. Okay, we're doing all those sort of choices are overlapping on existing landscapes of inequality, different socio-demographic backgrounds across the state or geography that you're working in. And so depending on the different methodology you use, you're going to be prioritizing different values and different beneficiaries. And that means that objectives of equity and efficiency can often be in conflict in how we use and deploy valuation research. So if you were to just look at, for example, a lot of the value of water quality data that was in that PNAS paper that I mentioned at the beginning was derived from hedonic property models. So these are looking at the additional value in lakeshore property owners' home values as a result of improvements in water quality. So cleaner lakes lead to more value accrues to property owners who have lakeshore property. But that's a very different set of beneficiaries. We know in Minnesota, for example, that those are more likely to be wealthier, more likely to be white homeowners, and it's not representative of the full population of the state, right? We're excluding a lot of the population if we just focus on estimating those values of those individuals. On the other hand, values that are very, very difficult to monetize, like the value of wild rice production and its cultural significance to indigenous tribes in Minnesota, is really absent from a lot of those traditional non-market environmental economic tools and approaches. And so where we're getting the big numbers, monetary numbers, that may be the most efficient way to spend our water resource dollars, but we are doing that at the expense of other values that aren't as easy to quantify using those methods, but are also incredibly important for objectives of equity. So I want to close with just a couple of recommendations that have emerged from this work that I think will move us in a direction of more inclusive valuation. And by inclusive, I mean thinking about the real, true, I think, original intent of ecosystem services research, which was to not miss out on any important benefits of different policies or decisions that we're making. How do we really mainstream a full accounting across lots of different benefits that nature provides to people, but also lots of different people and their important values that are often absent when you do aggregation up to a population level and you miss out on the ability to disaggregate and look at the distributional impacts of changes in environmental quality across populations. So I'm going to propose some recommendations and I'd love to hear your thoughts. But this is all in a paper that just came out last year in the annual review of resource economics, if people are interested in reading the full manuscript. So the first is just to start by diagnosing the decision context. I think as valuation researchers, as ecosystem service practitioners, we often jump to focusing on what we can measure before we step back and think, how is this information actually going to be used in real decisions? And who's the audience for this information? What's their agenda? What are they trying to do with it? And I think often as a result, we jump to these more sophisticated integrated assessment models or these complex non-market valuation approaches that may not actually be necessary in all contexts. So this little infographic at the bottom, I adapted from a previous paper, but I return to this a lot when I'm working with stakeholders, in that what do you actually need this information for? And one of the things that I've found is that in most cases, people are actually using valuation information just to raise awareness, right? They're trying to establish a common language. They're trying to shape hearts and minds. They're trying to grow a broader constituency for their work. They're doing some advocacy and they'd love to have like a little bit of extra ammunition to make the case that they want to make. In fewer cases are people actually using this information to set priorities, to design a cost, to design an instrument like a payment for ecosystem services scheme. So I think stepping back and really focusing on who's the audience, what are they going to use this information for, how will it be useful, can then help you be much more efficient and strategic in how you target the time and resources that it takes to do valuation. And of course, we're always in this tension between precision and efficacy, and that we can't be paralyzed by trying to model every last bit. These are complex systems. At the same time, we need information all the time to be moving decisions forward. This is just a little snapshot from a paper. I had a grad student who interviewed 40 different practitioners across private sector, state agency, and advocacy groups to understand how they used valuation research in process in practice, sorry. And again, just as I mentioned, we found pretty strong evidence that most of them are using valuation information to raise awareness, not necessarily to do this kind of cost benefit accounting, return on investment, prioritization exercises, or designing instruments. I mentioned this earlier, but recommendation is to really consider whose values are valued and to do that up front before you select your valuation instrument, the method you're going to be using. Whose values do you really want to capture? Because if you are just focusing on figuring out how you're going to get a number, then you may end up just capturing the values of a subset of people and missing the values that are really valuable. And that these egocentric, altruistic, and biospheric clusters of values often map onto equity considerations that are really important, and they require very different approaches to valuation in practice. Next is to just think spatially. So all of these, most ecosystem services have a strong spatial heterogeneity. They have spatial dependency. They vary across geographies. And just by not only acknowledging that and keeping that spatial information present as long as possible, and then also putting people on the map. So finding information on where people are living, where do they drink their water, where do they recreate, where do they hunt, where do they fish, what are the culturally important resources for them, that not only mapping the spatial distribution of the underlying biophysical phenomenon, but also the social and economic aspects that allow us to really investigate the distribution of changes in environmental quality across different groups. And then we know that in order for information on water valuation or ecosystem service valuation to be used, it has to be accessible, it has to be credible, and it has to be relevant. And that's supported by lots and lots of social science research across lots of different decision domains, is the importance of focusing on accessibility, credibility, and relevance in the way that we create knowledge and translate that into impact. And that's very consistent with what we found in interviewing different water stakeholders across Minnesota. And that means that we have to invest in things like co-development, contextually relevant stories. We found were actually perceived as much more credible and relevant than the more quantitative monetary metrics that we had developed. So if we really want to work on translating valuation data more directly into decisions, then investments in stories, investments in making data more accessible, more credible, more relevant is going to be part of what's going to get us there to that greater uptake. And so all this is to say, think about the process of valuation as much as you're thinking about the product, like what's that end number at the end of your study? And that means thinking about a whole bunch of different things. So where are you working? Who are the beneficiaries? Who's using that information? Where are the people? Can you continue to maintain as much of that sort of big complexity as possible before you go down into a one number or a single recommendation for moving forward? So as we close, I just want to return us to this whole set of policy objectives. So remember, we're not just focusing on efficiency. We actually want this broader tent of policy objectives. And I think as we are considering that, then it raises this question of what's the value of additional value information? How is more information or the next study or the next map or the next monetary evaluation study that you're going to do really going to then inform which of these policy objectives? How likely is it to change the result of past work? And how much is it going to be done in a way that it really enhances legitimacy, credibility, accessibility of that work so that it gets taken up into decisions? So with that, I will put my contact information up on the last slide. And I'll stop talking and pass it back over to Sarah and Lydia, and happy to take questions.
Thank you, Bonnie. This is fantastic. So I just want to remind people to put their questions in the chat. I'm going to kick us off with a few questions, and I think Sarah has a few already as well. And I just want to note, Bonnie, that there was a question about the framework paper you mentioned, and hoping that you can share the link to that. So if there were that paper, maybe there are a few others you want to share, but we can share them by email to the participants if you want, or you could put stuff in the chat when you have a moment, whatever works best for you.
Yep, sure, absolutely.
So I have a question. So about the kind of human-centric and ethnographic values that kind of are captured in these other methods. I'm just curious about, there's a number when it's not just about communication and people are trying to do accounting and designing policy and legislation. Have you been thinking at all about how some of these other methods can inform those kinds of decisions, which currently are very tied to those quantitative, more traditional valuation methods? I mean, I know in working with decision makers, there's a lot of discomfort with the current methods because of some of those, kind of perceived limitations of them. And expanding the suite of methods that are out there could be helpful, but it's a diversity of kinds of information that might be, hard to pull into those kinds of decision contexts. So I was curious what kind of thinking you've done around that already.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it gets at the heart of why this is challenging. I mean, there's some types of policy analysis, some types of decision making that's really just set up in a way that requires things to be simplified into a monetary metric to do a cost benefit analysis, for example. And in those, I think we're going to continue to see desire for methodologies for studies that help us to understand that framework and to fit into that particular context. So I'm not advocating that we should abandon all sorts of monetary metrics. I think there is important work to do there, but often in the focus of monetization and aggregation into that, I think we often lose a lot of the complexity, and we also lose a lot of the buy-in from those stakeholders in that process because it becomes very opaque whose values and what methods and where this information actually came from to begin with. We found that when we showed a bunch of return on investment studies to stakeholders that we were working with, and they were very, very skeptical about those cost benefit ratios. Like, where did this number come from? You get a 6-to-1 return on investment. How did you get that? I don't understand. And so I was almost surprised at just this sort of resistance to a lot of that monetary methodology when we showed it to decision makers, because I think we've all kind of bought into an argument that monetary metrics matter and that numbers matter, and demonstrating a positive return on investment really matters. And so I think there's multiple truths there. I think that case does matter. I also think that in most cases, politicians or decision makers use economics like a drunk uses a light post for support, not for illumination. And I think that most of us are taking information that sort of supports our preconceived notions about what we want and then constructing an argument based on that. And what we found in the sort of interview stage was that people were actually very receptive to compelling stories and narratives, especially if they connected to constituents that matter to them in ways that were more influential than actually the monetary metrics. So I think that's part of it is I would love to see, and I think this is sort of what that Biden memo advocates for, is how do we broaden the way that we think about regulatory review and policy analysis such that it's very inclusive of a variety of different methods. It's going to require our decision makers and our policy analysts to have an expertise in a set of different methodologies. I think we're a long way from, it puts a lot on them, right? If we're asking them to actually understand across a suite of different methods, how to interpret and weigh different kinds of evidence that is quantitative and qualitative, it's a huge challenge. And so you can understand why it's really nice to just have one number. But I'd love to hear other people's thoughts on this too, because I think it's a really important question.
Yeah, and I'd love to talk more about it sometime, but I want to open it up to others. So I'm going to leave you with one more question before I turn it over to Sarah to work on the other questions, which is just for those more human-centric kinds of results, have you, especially some of the ethnographic responses that seemed kind of on a broader scope, have you thought about how to map some of those? Some of them seemed much harder to put in kind of a spatial context, and I was curious, again, kind of where you've gone and thinking about that.
Yeah, I think some of them are mappable. So there's participatory mapping exercises, which is something we've also done where we bring stakeholders together and have them put, sticky notes or pins on a map to show locations of culturally important areas, or tell a story about a place that you went to as a kid, or identify a location on this map that has, and personal importance to you. So there are ways, I think, of collecting that information. you have to think about then how generalizable is that information? Can you actually do it at scale? What would it look like? How do you then take that information, combine it with other types? So I think that's a huge challenge. We have done some work using geolocated social media data as a way to try and scale up that insight. So using Flickr photos or Twitter tweets, we're starting to experiment with the deployment of chatbots at different trailheads. So you can actually have people respond to answer simple questions and give us some insight into how they're experiencing nature in different places. So I think there's some cool stuff on the horizon that might allow us to scale up that kind of cultural insight. But you're right, there's always going to be this trade-off between the intensity and time and resources needed to really investigate something at a local level that's very contextual, and then needing to generalize and expand that to a full population. I think that's just always going to be a central tension in this kind of work.
Great, thank you, Bonnie. Sarah, I'll turn it over to you.
Sure. So I've had two questions come in kind of about the Biden administration and the sort of new emphasis on broader values. So one is just, do you sort of see or foresee uptake of some of these alternative methods given the new emphasis in the administration on equity and environmental justice?
I hope so. I mean, I'd love to hear from your audience as well, if they've seen some evidence of this. The administration's made a really strong commitment to environmental justice. And in doing that, it's going to require a broader set of methodologies. I don't see how you can do a distributional analysis while you're looking at aggregating up, water quality values based on property assessments. So having people who can actually work across that. I mean, this is where I think I'm frustrated in just seeing the kind of divide in academia between economists who have a very well-developed set of tools that they're very much attached to maintaining and continuing to refine, and they're getting better all the time. And then you've got social scientists and human dimensions researchers and ethnographers and geographers, and they don't talk to each other and don't particularly collaborate very well. And so we don't have a ton of great models to show like, hey, this is actually possible. Look at this cool study that integrated these qualitative and quantitative methods and did it in a way that informed decisions. So I think it's a huge opportunity space for people who can work in that area. And I'd just love to see more examples of what that looks like.
Yeah, thank you. And there was kind of a follow-up question that was, if the Biden administration does want to better consider a broader suite of ecosystem services in their policies, is there a particular method or one thing that you'd recommend that they start with that could help start getting this type of information into the process?
Yeah, I think that there's so many great tools now. EPA has an EJ screen tool. A lot of states now have their own environmental justice type screening tools. We have an incredible resource in the census and American Community Survey data. So it's not hard to get the data that allows you to disaggregate your analysis by race, by income, by language. You can think about which of those factors are most important for particular types of ecosystem services. Like if we're looking at the health consequences of exposure to nitrate, you'd want to know, well, where are there low income populations that maybe don't have complete plumbing? You'd want to know where are there language barriers, where is water price a bigger percentage of people's income, where are people who have other compounding risk factors. And actually a lot of that data is available. So we can do a lot more than I see us doing right now to try and disaggregate benefits. And I think that this is a part that I sometimes get frustrated with the environmental economics profession, is that there's still this strong sense of focusing on values measured at the level of the individual and then being able to aggregate up to the full population, which in doing that, you really miss the opportunity to look at those equity and distributional constraints. So there's been some progress in things like equity weighting and other methods, but I think we have a long way to go before we're really looking at how do we reform that toolkit in a way that allows us to address the distributional consequences.
Yeah, thank you. And I see Joe Bachman has a hand up. If you want to unmute and ask your question, that's fine.
Okay, sure. Hey, yeah, first of all, Bonnie, I want to say this was excellent. It really was thought provoking for me. I teach finance at the Nicholas School. I come from a business investment background, so I've spent a lot of my career putting things into numbers to try to sell an idea. And I'd like to emphasize one of your points is that the story is much more important. And at some point, the numbers have to work as well. But I was really intrigued by your spectrum, going from the egocentric to the biospheric, and I'm just verbalizing here because I'm involved in some litigation here in Wisconsin, which is my home state, in which a municipality is putting a paved path through a riparian area, and it's this big argument over the public's right to enjoy this area versus the environmental harm that it's doing. And my question is really, how specific can you get into what methods resonate with different audiences? I think that's really intriguing from this example that I just cited. There's clear wildlife, drinking water, and also recreational access issues here. At the end of the day in Wisconsin, people want to catch fish. And I think that's what we've found is the thing that matters to people. But it begs these questions that you're posing.
Yeah, and it's interesting when you ask people, they don't come back and be like, well, I want the most efficient policy as a measure of improving net social welfare, right? Like that sort of what they want, are what they're most interested in are these things that connect to shared values. So and that in our work, like a lot of this things that come up over and over again is this concept of stewardship, which is very hard to measure in a contingent valuation survey or a choice experiment, right? Or a hedonic model, or travel cost model, but that people have a deep-seated sense of obligation and stewardship responsibilities for natural resources. And it was surprising how consistent that is across sector, across geography, rural to urban. That seemed to me like a really kind of interesting and very consistent trend, is that this concept of stewardship just had tons of resonance for people when you would ask them about what motivated them to protect natural resources or ecosystem services. And it just struck me at how our toolkit is so not fit to purpose to really estimate and elevate that kind of value. Whereas a compelling story about someone being able to fish in that wetland, or someone always taking their grandkid to go in the springtime and listen to the frogs, those are the kinds of things that really motivate people to take action. So I think that poses a really interesting challenge for us as practitioners. Like, how do you meld that narrative, qualitative data with the real strong kind of scientific evidence? And how do you use the scarce time and resources that we all have when we needed information yesterday and we only have a tiny window? Do you spend it doing interviews, or do you spend it doing a cost benefit assessment? Like, I don't have the answer to that, but I think that that by understanding the broader portfolio of potential kinds of stories and valuation information that we can produce, and being really thoughtful about what's going to actually move the needle, like what's going to actually be influential for different groups, is just an important exercise that frankly I don't think we do enough. So if anything, it's just to advocate for a little more reflection as we approach the valuation work that we all need to and want to continue to do.
All right, and I have a question here that maybe is going to be answered by your new paper, but someone asked, is there guidance somewhere for selecting a valuation method based on whose values you're interested in?
Yeah, there are some. And so some of that is in the paper that I put in the chat, but I think that there have been some other studies that have done a nice job of kind of looking at typology. So maybe you're thinking about, so is your policy context more oriented towards present sort of near-term changes, or is it oriented towards very long-term changes, like some things that'll happen in centuries? Is the policy issue very simple and clear and everyone can kind of visualize and understand it? Or is it pretty complicated and related to complex interactions and systems that are uncertain? There's a high deal of complexity and a normal person isn't very likely to understand a survey about a particular issue. So you can think about, a whole bunch, and then what kind of values? Is it more egotistical, kind of consumer choice, like I care about having more of X or Y, versus more stewardship, relational, altruistic, biospheric values that point then towards different methodologies, right? So we know from behavioral economics that people don't do very well on these stated preference surveys if it's a highly uncertain phenomenon, if it's far in the future, if it's very complex, if it's highly uncertain. The values you get from those are not very reliable, right? And we also know there's some values that are really only emergent through the process of deliberation. And so just asking an individual what they're willing to pay you may not observe the values you would if you had people then deliberate in a group setting, and different values are emergent from that process. So there are some useful typologies that are out there. And I think some of that stuff is in the paper, but if people want to follow up with me, I can point them towards some other references too.
Great. Well, we're almost at time here, so I just want to take a moment to thank you. Really, really appreciate you spending the time with us today, Bonnie. I think it was a fantastic talk and really, really useful information for all of us. So appreciate your coming and joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Lydia. Thanks, everyone.